White House has accused South Africa of weaponizing its G20 presidency, saying it undermines the group's founding principles. According to White House spokeswoman Anna Kelly, President Cyril Ramaphosa pushed through a leaders' declaration on climate change and global issues despite consistent and robust US objections. South Africa has
Africa's first ever G20 summit and the first boycotted by a member, the United States. Its host, South Africa, hails it as a success with a declaration agreed across a wide range of issues. But what's next for the G20?
Under heightened security, world leaders arrive in Johannesburg for the first G20 summit on African soil. The host nation has set out an ambitious agenda for this year's talks, focusing on climate change and confronting global inequality.
The adoption of the declaration from the summit sends an important signal to the world that multilateral can and does deliver. It tells the world that as the leaders of the G20, we will keep fast to our solemn pledge to leave no person, no community, and no country.
And I'll just say thank you to all of colleagues from Canada who have come to South Africa for the G20. I also want to begin by thanking President Ramaphosa for his leadership in hosting the first G20's Leaders Summit in Africa, as well as his generous hospitality and that of his team. Now, when President Ramaphosa attended the G7 in Kananaskis back in June, we discussed our shared priorities for Canada's G7 presidency and South Africa's G20. And even though Canada and South Africa are separated by long physical distances, we're bound by deep historical ties, by enduring friendship, and a promising future together. I just want to recall our Prime Minister Brian Mulroney standing in solidarity with South Africans in their struggle for freedom, leading by imposing sanctions and advocating for an end to apartheid. When South Africa emerged as a democracy, Canada was amongst the first nations to engage as their partner. Canadian judges and lawyers shared lessons from our own experience with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as South Africans wrote theirs.
Imagine this. At the Africa G20 summit, a quiet conversation behind closed doors suddenly explodes into the biggest economic and climate shock the world has seen in decades. Countries like Canada, Finland, Brazil, India, and South Korea didn't come for speeches, they came because Africa has become the new global center of power. And by the end of the summit, the entire world realized the balance had shifted forever. While Western analysts expected routine discussions, Africa launched something unimaginable, a unified economic and climate blueprint so powerful that even Europe's richest economies froze in disbelief. The continent unveiled the Pan-African Green Power Corridor, linking solar fields in the north, hydro stations in the west, geothermal giants in the east, and wind farms in the south into one massive clean energy supergrid. And here's the shocker: Africa announced that clean energy would no longer flow through Western intermediaries. Instead, electricity, hydrogen, rare earth processing, EV battery materials, and green-powered manufacturing would be exported directly to Asia and South America. And just like that, Europe realized its climate transition was now dependent on Africa. The US realized its entire green industrial plan had a fatal weakness and Wall Street felt the pressure of a new power it could no longer ignore. But the economic shock didn't end there. Africa revealed a climate-linked trade system. If a country wants access to Africa's critical minerals, food exports, or clean energy, it must commit to fair pricing, carbon accountability, and long-term industrial partnerships on African soil. No more extraction, no more one-sided contracts. No more exploitation disguised as climate aid. Brazil called it the new global standard. Finland said Africa was now the engine of the world's green revolution. Canada openly admitted the West had underestimated Africa's rise, and the US, silent, cornered, stunned. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa became the architect of global climate and economic policy, not the spectator. And the world finally understood. If you want a future powered by clean energy, technology, and sustainable growth, you need Africa more than Africa needs you. This summit didn't just start a conversation. It started a new world order, one built on green power, economic sovereignty, and alliances the West can no longer control.
Summit, citing what he claims is South Africa's mistreatment of white farmers. The Group of 20 Leaders Summit declaration was without US input.
There was a lot of caucusing on this. The fact of the matter is that there was a little bit of an objection from the Argentinian foreign minister around certain of the wording, certain of references to some of the conflicts, particularly Gaza, I think it was. Didn't really deter the process. So it shows you that the world is turning, and it will continue to turn.
Guided by the African Union Agenda 2063 and the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, the importance of addressing development priority from the African perspective cannot be overemphasized. Developing countries find themselves on debt trap as a result of capital high cost for developing countries based on the perceived risk that does not reflect the reality on the ground. In the face of unfair financing terms, recently, Namibia honored its international obligation by redeeming its $750 million Euro bond on time, signifying strong fiscal responsibilities. However, we are considered by decision makers as a risk country. We need a fair international financial institutions. Being the most meaningful way, we can place people at the heart of sustainable development. Our focus on advancing the transformation of global governance must be underpinned by the common understanding that only an inclusive and representative international system will have the capacity to respond to the present-day challenges. If our financial architecture is not fit for the purpose, we will continue to see the pressure of a looming global debt crisis that intensified imbalance between developed and developing countries. We are not seeking for free money. We want a fair and equal financing opportunities. For Namibia to grow and industrialize our economy, Namibia is welcoming investors to invest on value addition at source for our natural resources, including critical minerals, to yield a broad-based benefit for all our people.
The announcement came like a thunderclap across the world. Africa, after years of being sidelined and underestimated, had officially organized its own global summit, one powerful enough to draw countries like Canada, Finland, Brazil, India, South Korea, and even longtime Western partners who once dictated the global agenda. It was billed as the Africa G20 Summit, a historic gathering that signaled something far deeper than diplomacy. It marked the moment the continent stopped waiting for an invitation to major economic tables and instead built its own. And as world leaders boarded planes toward the largest economic meeting ever held on African soil, one nation was suspiciously uncomfortable with the sudden shift: the United States. For decades, America assumed that Africa would remain a geopolitical afterthought, important enough for speeches, charity announcements, and selective investments, but never powerful enough to steer world economics. That old worldview shattered overnight. The summit was not designed as a symbolic gesture. It was engineered as a strategic pivot, a chance for Africa to restructure its relationship with global powers and establish itself as a rising bloc capable of negotiating on equal terms. Infrastructure deals, energy partnerships, mineral policies, and digital frameworks were set to be rewritten, and the countries in attendance understood that missing the summit meant falling behind in a new global order. Canada, eager to secure long-term access to Africa's nickel and copper reserves, arrived with a delegation larger than the one it sent to its own regional summits. Brazil saw Africa not as a distant market, but as a strategic partner aligned with its own ambitions of reducing Western economic dominance. Finland came with a quiet determination to secure green technology alliances, knowing Africa's rare earth minerals were essential for the future of battery innovation and renewable energy expansion. And behind the diplomatic smiles and ceremonial handshakes, each delegation understood a simple truth: the balance of global power was shifting toward Africa, and attendance was not optional, it was survival. The United States watched this build-up with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. For months, Washington insiders dismissed the summit as symbolic, a political gesture with no real economic weight. But as the list of attending nations grew, and as countries traditionally aligned with the U.S. began drafting independent trade frameworks, with African blocs, the panic became impossible to hide. Analysts in New York and Washington quietly warned that Africa's rise as a coordinated economic force could weaken America's long-term control over global supply chains. Minerals needed for electric vehicles, semiconductors, aerospace, and defense were slipping out of unilateral Western influence. Africa was no longer negotiating separately with individual countries. It was negotiating collectively as a unified economic powerhouse. What frightened American officials most was not the attendance list, but the agenda itself. Africa planned to unveil a continental commodities exchange that would set its own prices for cobalt, platinum, manganese, graphite, lithium, and rare earth elements, resources that powered the global industrial system. The U.S. had depended on fragmented African markets for decades, ensuring it could negotiate cheaper deals and maintain influence through bilateral arrangements. But a continental exchange threatened everything. If Africa controlled its mineral pricing, then global corporations, especially American tech and EV giants, would lose their cost advantages. Production costs would rise, supply chains would tighten, and industrial competition would tilt toward regions that had invested early in Africa's economic future, such as China, India, and Turkey. By the time the U.S. recognized the scale of the threat, it was too late to downplay it. Media outlets across Europe were already calling the summit the new global South Power Table. Asian countries described it as the birth of Africa's economic century. Even the European Union, historically protective of its economic influence on the continent, acknowledged privately that Africa was no longer a junior partner, it was a major global actor capable of reshaping global markets. Meanwhile, the energy inside Africa was electric. Cities hosting the summit saw massive investments poured into new roads, smart transport systems, fiber optic networks, and clean energy grids. African financial institutions partnered with banks from the Middle East and Asia to fund these transformations, signaling a shift away from dependence on Western financial bodies. Delegates arriving from Finland and Brazil were stunned by the speed of development. High-tech zones, drone-based security monitoring, digital immigration systems, and AI-powered traffic management showcased a continent ready to lead. But what made the summit a crisis for America was something more profound than infrastructure or minerals. It was the shift in political alignment. Africa was finally choosing partners based on long-term strategic benefit, not historical pressure. Countries like Canada and Brazil, which had long acted as Western economic allies, were now openly competing for African partnerships. Even European nations, once confident in their influence, arrived at the summit with an urgency that revealed their fear of losing access to African markets. The U.S. delegation, unlike others, arrived without confidence or leverage. For years, American policymakers had treated Africa as an extension of Western economic policy, assuming the continent would always be available for resource extraction and political alignment. But the summit was built on a new ideology. Africa wanted equitable partnerships, not dependency. It wanted autonomy, not oversight, and it wanted respect, not conditional aid. When the agenda revealed Africa's plan for an independent digital currency settlement system intended to reduce reliance on the US dollar in intracontinental and intercontinental trade, the crisis became undeniable. For the first time, African nations were collectively challenging the global monetary order. If successful, this system would allow Africa to trade with Brazil, Finland, Canada, China, India, and other nations without using the dollar as a middle currency. That meant less demand for the dollar, tighter financing conditions for the U.S., and a weakening of America's global financial influence. What the U.S. had feared for years was finally unfolding: the rise of a multipolar world where Africa was not a passive participant but a central architect. The Africa G20 summit was a declaration that global power was no longer concentrated in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. It was dispersing, and Africa was claiming its place. As the first day of the summit closed, global markets trembled. Mineral futures fluctuated, energy stocks slipped, dollar indexes showed early signs of pressure, and in Washington, analysts quietly admitted what many had refused to believe. Africa's G20 summit was not simply a diplomatic event, it was the beginning of a billion-dollar geopolitical crisis for the United States. The second day of the Africa G20 summit unfolded with a precision that shocked even the most seasoned diplomats. What many expected to be a symbolic continuation of opening speeches turned into a full-scale re-engineering of global trade systems, one that placed Africa not at the margins but firmly at the center. By sunrise, the continent had already signaled a new direction. It was done playing the role of a raw material supplier. Instead, Africa aimed to become a global hub for manufacturing, innovation, finance, and strategic value chains. And as the proposals were unveiled, it became painfully clear why the United States saw the summit as a billion-dollar crisis spiraling out of its control. The morning session began with a groundbreaking declaration from a coalition of African economic ministers. They announced the formation of the Africa Industrial Acceleration Initiative, a continent-wide program backed by sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East, investment banks from Asia, and development partners from Latin America. Under this initiative, minerals and agricultural raw materials would no longer leave Africa unprocessed. Every participating country agreed to enforce new export rules demanding in-country processing, refining, or value addition. The impact of this single decision sent shockwaves through the attending delegations. Canada, Finland, and Brazil, all present with hopes of strengthening their industrial supply chains, recognized instantly what this meant. They would need to invest directly in Africa, build factories on African soil, and partner with African companies instead of shipping low-cost raw materials back home. For many nations, it was a realistic shift, but for the United States, the policy was catastrophic. America depended heavily on unrefined cobalt, manganese, bauxite, and lithium for its manufacturing sector. The U.S. had built billion-dollar industries by importing cheap African minerals and refining them domestically. With these new rules, that advantage collapsed overnight. American delegates, hoping to negotiate concessions, quickly realized they were alone. Canada expressed immediate support for the new initiative, stating publicly that collaborative industrial growth was the future of global trade. Brazil applauded Africa's move, calling it long overdue. Even European nations, quietly panicked but unwilling to appear resistant to Africa's rising influence, cautiously aligned themselves with the policy. Only the U.S. delegation remained silent, cornered, isolated, and increasingly aware that geopolitical influence no longer guaranteed economic compliance. But this was just the beginning. By midday, the summit introduced its next seismic shift, a continental logistics and aviation overhaul co-funded by African development banks, Middle Eastern sovereign funds, and Asian infrastructure partners. The project included the development of Africa's first unified cargo routing network, integrating ports from West Africa to the Horn of Africa and linking rail corridors through Central and Southern Africa. The goal was clear: to end dependency on Western-controlled shipping lanes and transportation companies. A digital tracking system, developed in partnership with Southeast Asian tech firms, would monitor goods from production to export without the involvement of Western intermediaries. As the plan was presented, countries like Brazil and India immediately pledged support, seeing the logistics network as a way to bypass Western bottlenecks and reduce shipping costs. Finland announced an interest in co-developing the green tech components, including solar-powered cargo hubs and biofuel-based shipping fleets. Again, the United States found itself on the losing end. Much of America's influence over global trade came from its dominance of shipping routes, insurance firms, and cargo logistics. If Africa successfully built a self-sufficient transport system supported by non-Western partners, U.S. companies would lose billions in revenue and influence. The atmosphere inside the summit's main hall grew more intense when Africa introduced the proposal that would redefine global competition, the Continental Innovation and Technology Compact, a strategy aimed at reducing dependence on Western technology firms by developing Africa-based alternatives in telecom, fintech, AI, and cybersecurity. Participating nations including Canada, Brazil, India, and South Korea agreed to share intellectual property, co-build research centers, and accelerate Africa's technological autonomy. The compact also outlined a new data governance framework, preventing external powers from extracting African digital data without strict regulatory agreements. This created immediate geopolitical tension. American tech corporations had long seen Africa as a major data market, profitable, expanding, and strategically important. But under the new compact, U.S. dominance in Africa's digital space was threatened. Nations like India and South Korea, already major players in emerging tech markets, welcomed the shift, anticipating billions in new investments and partnerships. Europe, especially Finland, known for its tech-driven economy, expressed strong interest in collaborative development. Once again, the U.S. found itself at odds with the new consensus, watching its technological footprint in Africa slip away. But the real crisis emerged in the afternoon session when African financial institutions presented a carefully guarded proposal, the creation of an Africa-led global credit and investment facility. This fund, backed by capital from Middle Eastern investors, Asian partners, and contributions from several African states, would finance continental infrastructure without relying on Western credit agencies. This was more than an economic plan, it was a direct challenge to U.S. financial influence. For decades, America leveraged institutions tied to the dollar to shape African economies through interest rates, credit ratings, and policy conditions. With this new facility, Africa could borrow and invest without permission from Washington or Wall Street. The U.S. delegation attempted to voice concerns, arguing that the facility might destabilize the global financial system. However, their objections were overshadowed by support from Canada, Brazil, and India, all of whom viewed the facility as a practical step toward global financial independence. Even some European countries, cautious but pragmatic, signaled their willingness to participate. The U.S. realized that its decades-long financial leverage over Africa was evaporating. The divergence widened when Africa introduced a controversial but revolutionary idea, shifting major trade settlements away from the U.S. dollar. The proposed multi-currency settlement system would allow Africa to conduct trade with Brazil, Canada, China, India, Finland, and others without relying on dollar conversions. This deviation from the dollar-dominant system represented a direct hit to America's global financial stability. Dollar demand would drop, American borrowing power would weaken, and Washington's ability to impose economic pressure through sanctions would diminish. As analysts whispered behind closed doors, the implications became clear. Africa as Summit was not simply restructuring trade, it was peeling away layers of U.S. power, one system at a time. Even outside the summit halls, the world was responding. Stock markets in New York and Frankfurt began to fluctuate as early reports predicted a global economic realignment. Companies dependent on cheap African raw materials saw their shares dip. Investors began shifting capital toward markets tied to Africa's new industrial initiative. Meanwhile, the energy sector reacted sharply when Africa announced plans to link its solar, hydro, and geothermal grids with Asian partners, aiming to become the world's largest supplier of clean energy by 2040. By the end of the second day, one thing was undeniable: the United States was no longer a default global leader. The summit had exposed a simple but powerful truth: Africa had choices, and those choices no longer revolved around American approval. Canada, Finland, Brazil, India, South Korea, and numerous other nations were walking through the doors America left open, forging alliances the U.S. never believed Africa capable of commanding. What began as a diplomatic gathering had evolved into a coordinated restructuring of global power, one that placed Africa squarely at the center and left America scrambling to understand how it had lost control of the world's fastest rising geopolitical force. The final day of the Africa G20 summit began with a tension so thick that even the most experienced delegates sensed that something historic was about to unfold. The world had already absorbed the shockwaves from Africa's new industrial policies, financial independence movements, and multi-currency trade systems, yet nothing compared to what the closing sessions were about to unleash. It was on this final day that Africa revealed the depth of its strategy, a blueprint that would not just shift global power, but permanently redefine where the center of the world economy would lie. The morning opened with a confidential briefing between Africa's heads of regional blocs and the attending nations from Canada, Finland, Brazil, India, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. The room buzzed with anticipation as they unveiled the most ambitious project of the summit, the Pan-African Resource and Manufacturing Grid, a sprawling multi-nation plan to merge industrial zones, energy corridors, agricultural belts, and technology hubs into a single integrated economic engine. Unlike previous frameworks fragmented across dozens of countries, this grid connected Africa's mineral deposits in the south to processing plants in the east, shipping ports in the west, and tech centers in the north. It was a fully connected value chain, one that completely bypassed Western intermediaries. Canada was among the first to pledge investment, eager to diversify away from US-dominated supply chains. Finland expressed interest in developing renewable-powered manufacturing clusters. Brazil saw an opportunity to bind its agricultural exports to Africa's rising agro-processing centers. India and Southeast Asia saw the grid as the fastest route to breaking Western monopoly over global manufacturing. Nearly every attending nation embraced the plan except the United States. The U.S. delegation had hoped the final day would bring opportunities to renegotiate or slow down Africa's rapid strategic realignment. Instead, they found themselves staring at a mega project that undermined every advantage Washington had built across minerals, food systems, manufacturing, and trade logistics. A grid of this scale and, with this level of international support, meant one thing: Africa no longer needed American capital, American corporations, or American diplomatic approval. The continent had secured alliances across the world, leaving the U.S. increasingly isolated. But the biggest blow to Washington came during the summit's next major announcement: Africa's Global Commodity Prioritization Framework, a system that restructured the continent's export hierarchy. Under this framework, African countries would prioritize exports to nations that agreed to long-term industrial partnerships, technology transfers, and fair value exchanges. Gone were the days when the West, especially the United States, could simply purchase critical minerals, food products, or energy resources without offering substantial economic reciprocity. This caused immediate panic in global markets. Analysts in London and New York feared that products like cobalt, lithium, manganese, gold, cocoa, and rare earths would now flow primarily to Asia and South America. Meanwhile, Western industries face massive shortages and increased prices. The announcement was a geopolitical earthquake. For decades, the U.S. had assumed African resources were guaranteed, secured through soft power diplomacy, military influence, or economic pressure. The summit shattered that assumption. As the afternoon progressed, the U.S. delegation made several attempts to propose alternative agreements, but each one fell flat. The momentum of global opinion had shifted unmistakably. With Canada and Finland backing Africa's green industrial zones, Brazil supporting agricultural transformation, India investing in technology and infrastructure, and South Korea offering advanced manufacturing expertise, the U.S. appeared outdated in its approach. Every American proposal centered on maintaining the old economic model, one where Africa supplied and the U.S. controlled. But the world had moved on, and Africa was now steering the pace. The most symbolic moment came during the unveiling of the Africa Global Trade Charter, a historic declaration outlining new trade principles rooted in fairness, sovereignty, and shared prosperity. The charter emphasized that no nation, regardless of power, would dictate African economic decisions. It rejected exploitative trade terms and reaffirmed Africa's right to process its own resources, set its own export rules, and negotiate partnerships based solely on mutual benefit. Brazil, India, and Southeast Asia signed the charter immediately. Finland and Canada expressed enthusiastic support. Even several European countries, though cautious about upsetting Washington, quietly signaled willingness to join. The U.S., however, refused to sign, citing concerns over strategic imbalance. But the refusal only highlighted how deeply Washington feared losing its historical grip on African trade. Outside the summit halls, global reactions grew even more intense. News outlets across Europe warned of an economic storm brewing, with industries dependent on African minerals facing severe disruption. Asian media celebrated what they called a new era of South-South cooperation. Stock markets from New York to Frankfurt saw increased volatility as investors scrambled to predict the new world order. Meanwhile, African markets experienced record surges, fueled by foreign investments that began pouring in from countries eager to break away from U.S.-dominated economic systems. As the closing ceremony approached, the final blow to U.S. dominance arrived through a surprise announcement. Africa would begin developing a continental energy exchange linking solar, hydro, geothermal, and wind power into a unified infrastructure capable of exporting clean energy to Asia, Europe, and Latin America. The plan, massively funded by the Middle East and supported by Brazil and India, promised to make Africa the world's largest exporter of green energy within the next 2 decades. The U.S., heavily dependent on fossil fuel interests and slow to adopt clean energy transitions, had no comparable offering. Once again, Washington found itself on the outside of a revolution it never thought Africa would lead. During the final address, the atmosphere reached a historic crescendo. Africa declared that the summit was not merely a gathering but a declaration of accountability to future generations. The continent had experienced centuries of extraction, exploitation, and economic manipulation. And now, with allies spanning from Canada to South Korea, from Brazil to Finland, Africa was building an economic fortress, one engineered to protect its interests and elevate its global power. As the summit concluded, delegates flooded out with signed agreements, long-term contracts, investment pledges, and joint venture blueprints. The mood across the hall was celebratory. But the U.S. delegation walked out in silence, burdened by the realization that they had witnessed the collapse of American influence in a region Washington once believed it controlled effortlessly. Back in global capitals, the world reeled from the summit's outcomes. Washington's think tanks scrambled to analyze the implications. Warning that America had lost its strategic foothold, European leaders privately admitted that the era of dictating Africa's economic choices was over. Meanwhile, in nations across the global south, Africa's rise ignited a new wave of confidence, proof that the world no longer needed to bend to Western dominance. By the end of the final day, one truth was unmistakable. The Africa G20 summit was more than a diplomatic victory. It was a geopolitical reset, a new blueprint for global power, and a moment when Africa emerged not as a passive participant in world affairs but as the architect of a future where sovereignty, partnership, and shared prosperity dominated global economics. And for the United States, it marked the beginning of a crisis that could reshape its position in the world for decades to come.